this is Shauna with Thoughts and Crafts, which is a page I made to share my thoughts and my crafts. So thank you to everyone who clicked on this video. If you did, you know generally what it's about. So today is MLK Day. Today I'm going to give my input on some of Charlie Kirk's remarks about Civil Rights Act of 1964, which King was a crucial part of, not through writing it, but through in part due to his peaceful demonstrations. All laws that have been passed have been on the backs of civil rights activists. So I've never done this before, but today it seemed appropriate. In discussing his remarks, I'm going to explain a lot of the context of these laws. The main points are going to be up on the screen right here. It's going to be information heavy, so try to stick with me. All the sources I have are referenced up on the screen at the relevant times, and you can see all the sources through the link in the description box. I'm going to be using clips of different videos, but I encourage you to watch the whole thing through of each of them if you haven't already. So last year on MLK Day, Charlie Kirk posted a podcast episode about how the MLK myth keeps America shackled to destructive 1960s laws that have replaced the original U.S. Constitution. That's according to the description box. So he did that on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. So to him, he was being bold to question him on his day. To me, it was unnecessary, not because I think you can't question anything about him, but because that's a day honoring all of the sacrifices that he made and the gains that he made for Black Americans. I wouldn't even make a video discrediting Charlie Kirk on the day honoring him. That whole thing was a controversy as well. Only 2 people voted against the resolution to dedicate a day to Charlie Kirk, one of whom was AOC. So I'm going to be using a video that discredited AOC and defended Charlie Kirk as my jumping off point, because it helps me circle back nicely to explain my point of the cruciality of the 1960s laws and the context leading up to them. So the video I'm going to share has over 2 million more views than the original video of AOC, which makes me wonder how many people watched that whole video of her explaining her reasons. Hopefully they watched it through a different source.
We should be clear about who Charlie Kirk was. A man who believed that the Civil Rights Act that granted Black Americans the right to vote was a mistake. His rhetoric and beliefs were ignorant, uneducated, and sought to disenfranchise millions.
If you're gonna call someone else's rhetoric ignorant, shouldn't you make sure your rhetoric isn't ignorant? The Civil Rights Act didn't give Black Americans the right to vote. The 15th Amendment did that a century earlier. Then, the Voting Rights Act in 1965 removed the barriers that states were still using to block Black people.
Okay, so my main point is why the Civil Rights Act isn't known for giving Black Americans the right to vote. But I want to address the mistake bit, which has probably been the greatest controversy. So Kaizen's defense is that that's not his point, because Charlie Kirk doesn't believe Black people should be discriminated against, but that the act has moved beyond what it was originally intended for. And he says AOC was using a strawman argument because Charlie Kirk supported the intent. Okay, so let me share another video of Charlie Kirk calling it a mistake. It was a time that a journalist emailed him about it, after overhearing him, and about his upcoming episode on MLK that I referenced earlier. He responded by doubling down, took that as a challenge, as if no one can question MLK, and making a longer episode than what he originally intended to do.
We are. And I'm just gonna tease it. You got to watch the show on Monday. And I just said it was kind of a throwaway line, right, Andrew?
It was such a throwaway line.
It was a throwaway thing. I'm just kind of doing this thing, and some tech blog called Wired Magazine.
You'd think they would write about
crypto
computers.
As we note in the piece, Kirk has previously described Kirk as a hero and a civil rights icon. It's true. I used to be wrong. What inspired Kirk to shift his view on MLK? Why does Kirk think that MLK is a bad guy? When Kirk says that MLK says, quote, one good thing he didn't believe, what does he mean by that? Why does Kirk believe passing the Civil Rights Act was a mistake? Now, again, apparently they don't listen to the show because we do that at least once a week, right? Once a week we talk about why the Civil Rights Act was a mistake. Does Kirk believe that racial segregation should be permitted in the United States? Jack, it's not as if there's no tech stories out there. For Wired magazine to cover, you got tunnels underneath Chabad, you got all sorts of crazy things going on. And the fact that I have some sort of throwaway line, like I'm planning an EMP, that like the Charlie Kirk show is, in some ways, we kind of are. And again, I don't want to bury the lead, but how did we get here? And how much of our race-obsessed politics is because of the elevating of MLK? And so what was originally planned as a little sideshow is going to be the main show.
Yeah.
So here's my conclusion. My conclusion is that Charlie Kirk made this dilemma for himself. He used a shock value word that sometimes he said without any context.
I have a question.
Okay, what's your question?
Why did you say that the Civil Rights Bill should be overturned?
Well, I didn't say that. I said it was a mistake.
Why? That's crazy.
Now you gotta figure it out.
I wouldn't be here. That's trouble.
Exactly.
He created snippets for himself. Language is important, and calling it a mistake is the wrong word if he believed that parts of the Civil Rights Act were good, which is what Kaizen referenced in his video. With that being said, he cannot change. He cannot grow or evolve on this earth, but we can. That's why we're looking at these things critically, and that's one of my main motives for Thoughts and Crafts, is to promote that really critical thought process. Obviously, without being pedantic, we need to use words with purpose. It's better to say, let me explain that later, or maybe that's not the best word that really reflects my thoughts, than to just use a word that's going to be noticed. So should AOC have used the word mistake in her speech, or should she have elaborated? There is a lot of language she could have used that reflected his views and still held her point. What do you think about this? Okay, so in the next clip, he refers to it as a mistake again, but explains some of his reasons fairly well. I'm not going to be getting into the reasons, but I want to focus on what he describes as his solution, or what he thought the Civil Rights Act should have said. So I'm going to play the beginning and the end, and again, go back and watch the whole thing.
You've condemned the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as a huge mistake.
Correct.
Why do you believe it was a mistake to pass anti-discrimination legislation? And what do you think would be better policy for being treated fairly and equally, which you see as an American principle?
Yeah, nothing against the intent, but it was too broadly written, and it played into something called disparate impact. Disparate impact was woven within the Civil Rights Act, and so because of that, the Civil Rights Act was too broadly written. So the intent, it should have been a single page or a two-page bill to say that you cannot discriminate against based on the color of somebody's skin, period, end of story. Instead, we get a multiple 100-page bill with lots of chapters and lots of lesser-known amendments that created basically a permanent anti-racist bureaucracy within our federal government to go find racism where it doesn't exist and create it new places where otherwise did not exist.
The main thing I'm going to focus on here is him saying it should have been a 1 or 2 page document saying you cannot discriminate against someone based on the color of their skin. My issue with that is part of the reason that the Civil Rights Act wasn't known for giving Black Americans the right to vote. Okay, so we're coming into our main point now. Let's rewind to Kaizen's criticism of AOC really quick.
The Civil Rights Act didn't give Black Americans the right to vote. The 15th Amendment did that a century earlier. Then, the Voting Rights Act in 1965 removed the barriers that states were still using to block Black people.
So when I heard that, the first thing I asked was why. It's this big, broad document. To be clear, it's a 22-page document, so 100 pages is exaggerated language that has gone way beyond its intent, but did not address the loopholes that still existed from the 15th Amendment the century prior. Why not? And why was it its own law the next year in the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Again, why did it take 100 years until effective law was put into place? Okay, so spoiler alert, but not really because it's history. But it did address voting rights, but is it known for that? But now we're going to rewind to the 15th Amendment.
The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted African Americans citizenship. The 15th Amendment outlawed discrimination in voting rights. Contrary to popular belief, the 15th Amendment does not grant the right to vote to anyone. It simply outlaws discrimination in voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Congress failed to provide enforcement for the amendment originally. Enforcement did not come until 1870 with the passage of the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871.
The 15th Amendment also did not include black women, so they largely did not get the right to vote until 1965, even though all women supposedly got the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. So Charlie Kirk's solution was the original issue with ensuring voting rights for African Americans. So just making a law that says you can't discriminate isn't effective. Okay, it wasn't effective then, and it wasn't effective in the 60s, and I'm going to get to that. The issue was enforcement. At the time, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, poll taxes were not deemed unconstitutional according to the 15th Amendment. Black people trying to register to vote were threatened or met with competency tests. So, why aren't the Force Acts of 1970 and 71 known as ensuring Black Americans the right to vote? Why did we still have to wait until 1965? They authorized federal authorities to enforce penalties upon anyone interfering with registration and voting. They provided federal election supervisors. They gave the president the right to military forces to make summary arrests. Some counties in the South were even placed under martial law. The federal government could use force against the Ku Klux Klan and also gave them heavy fines. But then in later years, parts of these acts were declared unconstitutional. And in 1878, a law was passed that withdrew federal forces aiming to protect citizens and their rights. In 1875 was the last civil rights law of the Reconstruction era. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 was deemed unconstitutional because Congress lacked the authority to regulate private discrimination. By the 1890s, many of the political gains that Black Americans had achieved during Reconstruction was largely erased, especially in registration and voting in southern states. The next time a civil rights bill was passed wasn't until 1957, when the federal government finally responded to the demands of civil rights activists, after years of bills being presented since 1945. You have to remember, this was on the backs of civil rights activists who were being terrorized by the KKK. And guess what it addressed? Guess what that law addressed? It addressed voting rights. But that also is not known for giving Black Americans the right to vote. Since opposition was so strong in the South, the final bill, it came out really weak. The federal government being able to prevent interference with civil rights instead of just being able to punish after the fact was a key component that didn't make it into the bill. Due to such opposition, it was then amended in 1960. A weakened version of the enforcement section made it into the bill and passed the Judiciary Committee. It got stopped in the Rules Committee, then until activists again protested and it made it to the floor. After being weakened again, it passed and then moved to the Senate Judiciary Committee. James Eastland was a segregationist who refused to act on the bill. When it finally made it to the Senate for debate, among almost all Southern senators participated in a filibuster. In the end, Southern Democratic senators could dictate the terms of the bill. So this is 1960, 4 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. What was the reason for the opposition? Well, one of the reasons was that many Southern Democrats claimed it encroached on the rights of states to control the election process. They referred back to what they considered their rights to be. Even after the bill was passed, African Americans who tried to vote lost their jobs and faced violence and fraud. Okay, so then it was amended yet again in what we know as Title I of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So then why do we think that merely saying don't discriminate against Black people is somehow going to be effective against segregationists who at every turn took every loophole and every liberty to bring Black people back to how they were before they had any rights? The specific language of the Civil Rights Act of 1965 is what made it successful. It changed how the federal government could be involved in ensuring rights. It was written to prevent voting discrimination before it happened. Some jurisdictions had to actually get approval for how they administered elections. Why did the VRA have to spell all that out? Well, they learned from the other times that they tried to ensure voting rights for Black Americans. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 enforced their voting protections against after-the-fact litigation, a mechanism that was regarded as largely ineffective by the time Congress considered the VRA. It was ineffective. They didn't care. They prevented Black people from voting in these areas because they didn't care that they were going to get in trouble after the fact if they didn't allow them to register. They didn't care. They needed something to prevent segregationists from keeping Black Americans from their right to register to vote. It wasn't a total failure in the Voting Rights Act. It is considered separate from the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and is still used in some litigation cases today. It also was an upgrade of previous voting laws, seeking to rectify the whole point of the 15th Amendment. It also set the tone for the success of the VRA because the federal government just started becoming active in protecting voting rights again in the 50s and the 60s. Okay, so we have 1964 and then we have 1965. The Voting Rights Act didn't just come about because legislators saw that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was ineffective. They didn't just see, oh wow, this isn't really working, we should do something better. King had met with President Johnson 2 days before the event that ultimately led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That was in Selma, Alabama, a place where only 2% of Black Americans were registered to vote, even though they made up more than half the population.
The SCLC intends to make this injustice an issue the nation can't ignore. Selma will be the starting point for a 50-mile march to the State House in Montgomery, where the people will present their demands to Governor Wallace himself.
Nobody expected Sunday to be bloody because the cameras was there, the whole world was watching.
We thought they were going to be arrested, but instead, Sheriff Clark rode through the crowd on horseback, beating people.
CBS interrupted the showing of Judgment at Nuremberg on that Sunday night to show those peaceful protesters being beaten on that bridge. It woke up many parts of America that had turned away from fully understanding what the fight for equal rights was really all about.
President Johnson gave this speech to Congress a week after the march. The harsh fact is that in many places in this country, men and women are kept from voting simply because they are Negroes. Every device of which human ingenuity is capable has been used to deny this right. The Negro citizen may go to register, only to be told that the day is wrong, or the hour is late, or the official in charge is absent. And if he persists and he manages to present himself to the registrar, he may be disqualified because he did not spell out his middle name or because he abbreviated a word on the application. And if he manages to fill out an application, he is given a test. The registrar is the sole judge of whether he passes the test. He may be asked to recite the entire Constitution or explain the most complex provisions of the state law. And even a college degree cannot be used to prove that he can read and write. For the fact is that the only way to pass these barriers is to show a white skin. No law that we now have on the books can ensure the right to vote when local officials are determined to deny it. So while Kirk argued that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 replaced the Constitution, opponents of the VRA did the same thing. Some opponents of the VRA and predecessor legislation argued that tests and devices that the VRA later prohibited were state prerogatives, were necessary for an informed electorate, or both. For example, a Georgia attorney told Senate Judiciary Committee in 1962 that bills prohibiting literacy tests would seek to establish a government of the ignorant, by the ignorant, and for the ignorant. In a precursor to a debate over the VRA, Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Sam Ervin
argued that Congress and the states intended the 15th Amendment to mean exactly what is said. The color of a man cannot be a reason to grant or deny him the right to vote, but all other qualifications which have no reasonable relation to race or color are left entirely to the wisdom of the states. Congress and federal courts, including the Supreme Court, eventually determined that the tests and devices that the VRA prohibited, such as literacy tests, were in fact based primarily on race and thus constitutionally impermissible. So let me read another argument against the bill. Senator James Eastland said that the bill flies directly in the face of the Constitution of the United States. Let me be clear. I am opposed to every word and every line in the bill. I believe that it is an unheard of thing. This bill would apply to only 5 states. It is sectional legislation. It is regional legislation. The bill's sponsors were made to come together only yesterday morning. Then the bill was dropped in the hopper, and it is proposed to refer to the Judiciary Committee with only 15 days time to consider. I do not see that it is an orderly legislative process. So VRA supporters countered that the legislation was necessary to implement the 15th Amendment, which the Jim Crow era had rendered ineffective. This is what Senator Dirksen argued. In 1870, when the 15th Amendment was approved, it was asserted that no citizen of the United States, and I emphasize, no citizen of the United States shall be deprived of or denied his voting rights or have such voting rights abridged by the United States or by any state because of race or color. We could be prepared to come into the chamber with 1,000 cases and show that is precisely what happened. It is almost astounding the ruses, the devices, the schemes which were employed to deny that right. After a period of 95 years, we are trying to catch up to the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which in good faith was ratified by the states and was intended to be enforced because it provided in the second section of the amendment that Congress shall have the power to implement and to do the necessary things to give effect to the 15th Amendment. Thus, on constitutionality and on working time, the Senate should be satisfied. How long do we have to thresh old straw? Voting rights is not a problem in one section of the country. The Civil Rights Act has many sections and subsections because it tried to cover every basis that a segregationist might come after, but still failed in ensuring all Black Americans their right to vote, which is why it's not known for that. And remember, Black women had to work extra hard to ensure their own rights to vote. That doesn't mean we should never revisit it or review it, or that every time someone says something is racist, that it automatically is. But we need to be informed by our history. The intent of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is irrelevant if the government didn't prevent racism before it started, which is precisely why the language of the Constitution falls short and other bills needed to be passed. So it falls short for people who don't want to see Black people standing side by side with them, who would rather see them back as property, or at least as far from them as possible, who don't want them to have a voice. But they do have a voice because of activists like MLK and many, many, many others who need to be recognized. MLK was jailed 29 times. He was stabbed. Rocks were thrown at him. His home was bombed. The FBI wiretapped his home and tried to damage his reputation. He still marched on until the day of his assassination. And he lives on through his accomplishments and through our memory of him. Not all the memory of him is positive. However, let's not use that as a basis to discredit all that he made possible for Americans today.